Sparta is remembered as a city of heroes, but the foundation of Lacedaemon was forged not in glorious sacrifice, but in the ruthless, methodical slaughter of its neighbors. The modern myth paints them as flawless super soldiers defending freedom, but the brutal, paranoid reality was an isolationist military camp built entirely on the crushed spines of an enslaved majority. To maintain this brutal hierarchy, the Spartan state faced the constant, crushing threat of massive uprisings from within and the grinding attrition of warfare beyond the towering, jagged peaks of the Taygetos Mountains. Tell us where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Settle in, turn off the modern world, and step into the unforgiving valley of the Eurotas. Here, the early Dorian settlers consolidated four scattered villages, Pitana, Missoa, Limni, and Kynosura, into a single, unwalled stronghold. They rejected massive stone fortifications, choosing instead to rely entirely on the absolute physical dominance of their infantry. As the population of this new Spartan state expanded, the fertile alluvial soil of the Eurotas Valley proved insufficient to feed the growing ranks of warriors. The dual kings of Sparta did not negotiate for trade routes. They marshaled their forces, crossed the mountain passes, and launched a massive, unprovoked invasion of the neighboring territory of Messenia. The First Messenian War was a grinding, decades-long campaign of absolute subjugation. Spartan phalanxes marched across the plains of Sthenoclaris, driving the Messenian defenders back into the fortified heights of Mount Ithome. The Spartans encircled the mountain, cutting off all food and water supplies, turning the siege into a brutal starvation campaign. King Theopompus directed the systematic dismantling of Messenian resistance, executing captive leaders and burning the surrounding agricultural lands to deny the enemy any harvest. The physical reality of this conquest permanently altered the trajectory of the Greek world. The victorious Spartans did not exact temporary tribute. They completely annexed the vast, fertile plains of Messenia and enslaved the entire population. Hundreds of thousands of Messenians were stripped of their autonomy and forced into brutal agricultural labor under the permanent threat of death. These conquered people became the Helots. They were chained, beaten, and forced to hand over half of every harvest directly to their Spartan overlords. The Spartan state divided the stolen land into individual plots, granting them to their citizens to fund their perpetual military training. The maintenance of this massive slave state required a terrifying level of violence. Spartan warriors patrolled the newly conquered territories with iron-tipped spears, enforcing curfews and crushing any gathering of helots. The dust rising from the dry Peloponnesian dirt coated the bronze greaves of the Spartan vanguard as they drove columns of chained captives back toward the Eurotas. The entire Spartan society was now a heavily armed minority living atop a powder keg of human misery, acutely aware that any moment of weakness would result in their own annihilation. The conquest of Messenia provided the food that fed the Spartan war machine, but it also locked the city into a permanent state of internal warfare. To survive their own victory, the Spartans had to transform themselves into an instrument of absolute terror. The kings issue the final orders, and the army marches out of the valley. The absolute dependence on a massive, hostile slave population forced the Spartan state to undergo a radical, terrifying transformation under the decrees of the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. The Great Retra, the foundational set of laws, stripped away all individual wealth, luxury, and comfort, turning the unwalled city into a permanent military barracks. To ensure no citizen could challenge the state, the government was divided into a complex, self-policing hierarchy. 2 hereditary kings from the Aegead and Europonid lines commanded the armies. A council of 28 elders shaped policy, and 5 ruthlessly pragmatic ephors held the power to arrest anyone, including the kings themselves. The ephors stripped the city of precious metals, banning gold and silver entirely. In their place, they instituted a currency of heavy iron spits, useless for foreign trade and cumbersome to hoard, physically isolating Sparta from the broader Mediterranean economy. The most brutal enforcement of the Lycurgan system fell upon the youth. At the age of 7, male children were ripped from their families and thrust into the Agoge, a state-run system of institutionalized abuse and relentless military conditioning. The state starved the boys deliberately, forcing them to steal food from the surrounding countryside to survive. If caught, they were not punished for the theft, but for the incompetence of being detected. The boys marched barefoot through the freezing Peloponnesian winters, dressed only in a single thin red cloak, their feet calloused and bleeding on the sharp limestone rocks. They slept in communal packs on beds of reeds they tore from the banks of the Eurotas River with their bare hands, denied even a blade to cut the stalks. The culmination of this brutalization occurred at the altar of Artemis Orthia, where adolescent boys were forced to endure savage, prolonged floggings to prove their absolute submission to pain and state authority. The heavy crack of a whip echoed across the stone sanctuary, tearing flesh from the backs of the initiates while priests and magistrates watched in cold silence, searching for any sign of weakness. Those who flinched or cried out were publicly shamed, their social standing annihilated. The Agoge broke the individual down to the bone and rebuilt him entirely as a replaceable component in the Spartan war machine. Friendship, family, and personal ambition were entirely replaced by absolute loyalty to the phalanx and the state. This system of state-sanctioned torture forged warriors who viewed death in battle as infinitely preferable to the shame of defeat. The older boys were tasked with enforcing discipline on the younger, creating a violent hierarchy where survival depended entirely on physical dominance and strict obedience. The magistrates walked the training grounds daily, ordering random beatings and sudden skirmishes to keep the youth in a state of perpetual aggression. The city operated like a massive, open-air prison camp where every citizen was both a guard and a prisoner to the system. A young boy wipes the blood from his face and steps back into formation. The survival of the Spartan elite depended entirely on the systematic terrorization of the Helot population. Outnumbered by as much as 7-1, the Spartans instituted a relentless regime of psychological and physical warfare against their own subjects. Every autumn, the 5 ephors took office and immediately declared formal war against the Helots, a chilling legal maneuver that allowed any Spartan citizen to murder a Helot without incurring the religious pollution of blood guilt. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a practical directive to cull the strongest, smartest, and most capable slaves before they could organize a rebellion. The state deployed the Krypteia, a secret police force composed of the most promising young men who had recently completed the Agoge. These young assassins were stripped of their armor and sent out into the harsh countryside with nothing but a dagger and minimal rations. They hid in the scrub brush of the Taygetos foothills during the day, observing the Helots working in the fields. When night fell, they descended upon the villages, kicking down doors and slitting the throats of any Helot deemed a threat to the state. The smell of sweat and polished bronze permeated the barracks, but the Krypteia smelled only of dirt and dried blood as they executed their grim work. They targeted the community leaders, the unusually strong laborers, and anyone who showed even a flicker of defiance. The bodies were left in the fields as a visceral warning to the rest of the slave population: absolute submission or immediate death. The Helots were tied entirely to the agricultural estates, forced to produce the grain, wine, and olive oil that sustained the Spartan citizen soldiers. The Spartan masters demanded a fixed, crushing quota of the harvest. If a plot of land failed to produce, the Spartan citizen who owned it faced the absolute humiliation of losing his citizenship, as he could no longer contribute his required share of food to the communal mess halls. This relentless pressure flowed downward. The Spartans beat and starved their Helots to ensure the quotas were met, extracting every ounce of labor through brute force. The state also forced the Helots into humiliating public displays to reinforce their subservience. During festivals, slaves were forced to drink unmixed wine until they were violently ill, then paraded before the Spartan youth to demonstrate the shameful, degrading nature of drunkenness and lack of discipline. The Spartan society was a tightly coiled spring of violence, always anticipating the moment the Helots would rise up. Every military decision, every diplomatic alliance, and every law was fundamentally shaped by the desperate need to keep the slave population crushed beneath the heel of the hoplite. A Krypteia patrol vanishes into the freezing night. With their internal slave population brutally suppressed, Sparta turned its aggression outward, seeking to dominate the entire Peloponnese through overwhelming military force and strategic alliances. They launched a punishing campaign against the neighboring city-state of Tegea, initially marching with chains to enslave the population, only to be thrown back in a grinding tactical defeat. Recognizing the limits of their manpower, the Spartan kings shifted their strategy from annihilation to hegemony, forcing Tegea into an unequal alliance that demanded total military subordination. This brutal diplomacy formed the foundation of the Peloponnesian League, a massive military coalition entirely controlled by the Spartan ephors. To secure their dominance, the Spartans challenged the ancient rival power of Argos. The two cities agreed to settle their dispute over the fertile territory of Thyrea not with a full-scale war, but with a brutal, confined engagement known as the Battle of the 300 Champions. 300 of Sparta's deadliest warriors faced 300 Argives in a confined, horrific melee of bronze and shattered wood. The combat was not an elegant duel. It was the brutal reality of hoplite warfare, an agonizing contest of sheer physical exhaustion. The crushing weight of the oak core aspis shield tore at the muscles of the warriors as they smashed into one another, driving the iron tips of their heavy spears through bronze cuirasses and human flesh. The battle ground down until only 3 men remained alive, 2 Argives and a single wounded Spartan named Othryades. The Argives, believing they had won, left the field to carry the news back to their city. Othryades, bleeding heavily into the dirt, refused to abandon the ground. He dragged himself among the corpses of his fallen comrades and enemies, collected the shattered weapons of the Argives, and erected a bloody trophy of victory on the battlefield. When the full armies returned the next day, both sides claimed victory, and the resulting mass slaughter saw the Spartan phalanx completely shatter the Argive line. This victory cemented Spartan supremacy over the Peloponnese. The phalanx tactics perfected by the Spartans relied on the terrifying momentum of the ophismos, the physical push. Heavily armored men locked their massive shields together and drove forward in unison, literally trampling their enemies into the earth. The Spartan state formalized its treaties, forcing every allied city to swear an oath to follow Sparta wherever she led. The unwalled city on the Eurotas now commanded the largest, most disciplined military force in the Greek world, sustained by the blood of the Helots and the forced compliance of their neighbors. A Spartan herald drives his spear into the Argive soil. The supreme isolation of the Spartan state was violently disrupted by the sprawling, imperial expansion of the Persian Empire. King Darius launched the first punitive expedition across the Aegean, aiming to crush the Greek cities that had defied his absolute authority. When the Athenian runner Phidippides arrived in Sparta, desperately demanding military aid against the Persian beachhead at Marathon, the Spartan state machinery halted. The magistrates rigidly adhered to the laws of the Carnea, a sacred religious festival that absolutely forbade the marching of the army until the full moon. They refused to break the festival decrees, prioritizing their internal religious stability and the fear of divine retribution over the immediate survival of their Athenian neighbors. 10 years later, the Persian king Xerxes launched an invasion force of unprecedented scale, bridging the Hellespont and marching a massive, multi-ethnic army down the Greek coast. The sheer size of the Persian invasion threatened to consume the entire peninsula, yet once again, the Spartan commitment was restricted by the timing of the Carnea. The ephors and the Gerousia compromised, sending King Leonidas north with a mere 300 elite Spartiates, men who already had living sons to ensure their bloodlines survived the inevitable slaughter. This small vanguard was accompanied by thousands of allied hoplites and heavily armed helots, forced to march alongside their masters to delay the Persian advance at the narrow coastal pass of Thermopylae. The march north was a grueling endurance test. The blistering summer heat baked the heavy bronze armor of the phalanx as they advanced through the rugged terrain of central Greece. Leonidas commanded a rigid, unyielding formation, securing the choke point where the mountains crashed down into the Malian Gulf. They rebuilt an ancient Phocian wall across the narrowest point of the pass, dragging heavy stones to create a physical barrier against the vast Persian numerical superiority. The Spartan strategy was raw, brutal attrition. Plug the gap, forced the lightly armored Persian infantry into a bloody meat grinder, and by time for the rest of Greece to mobilize. When Persian scouts rode up to the Spartan lines, they found the warriors completely unfazed by the impending annihilation. The Spartans sat in the dust outside the wall, stripping their weapons, polishing their bronze, and calmly combing their long hair, a traditional preparation for a fight to the death. Leonidas rebuffed the Persian demands to surrender their arms, preparing his men to inflict maximum casualties in the tight confines of the pass. The royal guard locks their shields together at the middle gate. Thermopylae was not a glorious, sanitized sacrifice. It was a desperate, horrific slaughter designed to break the momentum of a massive imperial army. The narrow pass nullified the Persian numerical advantage, forcing wave after wave of Medes and Scythians to crash directly into the interlocking bronze wall of the Spartan phalanx. Leonidas employed ruthless tactical deception, ordering his men to feign terror and retreat in chaos, drawing the Persian infantry out of their formations. Once the Persians broke ranks to pursue, the Spartans abruptly wheeled around, locking their heavy oak core shields together and driving their iron-tipped spears through the lightly armored mass of the enemy. The sickening crunch of bronze against bone echoed off the towering cliff face as the Spartan killing machine ground down the invaders. Xerxes, watching the massacre of his vanguard from a golden throne on the hillside, threw his elite immortals into the choke point. Even these heavily armed shock troops could not penetrate the dense wall of Spartan bronze. The battle became a physical nightmare of crushed bodies, shattered spears, and men slipping on the blood-soaked earth. For 2 days, the Greek forces held the line, rotating fresh units to the front to maintain the relentless physical pressure of the Othismos. The Spartan dead were dragged behind the wall, their armor stripped and reassigned to the surviving helots and allies fighting in the rear ranks. The brutal calculus of the battle shifted entirely when a local Trachinian named Ephialtes guided the Persian forces along a hidden goat path over the mountains, outflanking the Greek position. Recognizing the encirclement, Leonidas dismissed the bulk of his allied forces to preserve their lives for the defense of the Peloponnese. He remained in the pass with his 300 Spartans, 700 Thespians who refused to leave, and 400 Thebans held virtually as hostages. They abandoned the defensive wall and marched out into the wider part of the pass to inflict absolute carnage. When their heavy ash spears finally splintered and shattered, the Spartans drew their short iron swords, hacking at the Persian masses in a desperate, frenzied melee. When their swords broke, they fought with their hands, their teeth, and the broken rims of their shields, dragging the Persians down into the mud until they were finally buried under a massive volley of arrows. The stand at Thermopylae secured no territory, but it proved to the Persian command that the conquest of Greece would demand a river of blood. The Persian immortals step over the broken bodies of the Spartan dead. The death of Leonidas did not break the Spartan resolve. It forced them to unleash the full, terrifying scale of their military machinery. The following spring, the Persian general Mardonius occupied the scorched ruins of Athens, attempting to lure the Greeks into a decisive battle on the open plains of Boeotia, terrain perfectly suited for his devastating cavalry. The Spartan regent, Pausanias, finally marched the entire Peloponnesian army north, crossing the mountains to join forces with the Athenians and the remaining Greek allies. They assembled at the foothills of Mount Cithaeron near Plataea, forming the largest heavy infantry army the Greek world had ever seen, numbering nearly 40,000 hoplites. For days, the two massive armies faced each other across the Aesopus River, locked in a brutal standoff. Neither commander wanted to abandon their defensive position. Mardonius unleashed his mounted archers to harass the Greek lines, relentlessly poisoning and choking the Gargantuan spring, the sole water supply for the massive Spartan contingent. Forced to withdraw under the cover of night to secure a new water source, the Greek retreat devolved into dangerous chaos. As dawn broke, the Spartan and Tegean contingents found themselves isolated on a ridge, cut off from their allies, and completely exposed to the entire Persian cavalry charge. The blinding glare of the morning sun on 70,000 spear tips signaled the final Persian assault. Pausanias ordered his men to sit in the dirt, Their massive shields held over their heads as a storm of Persian arrows rained down upon them. They absorbed the agonizing barrage without breaking formation, waiting for the omens from the animal sacrifices to turn favorable. Men died silently in the ranks, refusing to rise until the command was given. Finally, Pausanias ordered the charge. The massive Spartan phalanx rose as a single entity and crashed down the slope into the wicker shield wall of the Persian infantry. The heavier armor and the brutal, pushing mechanics of the Spartan hoplites tore through the Persian lines. Mardonius, fighting bravely on a white horse, was struck down by a Spartan stone, and his death shattered the command structure of the invading army. The Persian forces broke and fled back to their fortified wooden camp. The Spartans relentlessly pursued them, breaching the wooden palisades and slaughtering tens of thousands of trapped soldiers in a confined, horrific massacre. The Persian threat to the Greek mainland was permanently destroyed by the raw, uncompromising brutality of the Spartan heavy infantry. The Allied army marches north to burn the Persian camp. Just as Sparta reached the absolute pinnacle of its military prestige, the physical world tore the state apart. In 464 BC, a catastrophic earthquake ripped through the Eurotas Valley. The ground heaved violently, shattering the unwalled city and instantly burying thousands of Spartan citizens under collapsing stone and timber. The deafening roar of falling stone and collapsing temple roofs echoed across the valley, decimating the elite warrior class in a matter of seconds. Only 5 houses remained standing. The strict, regimented world of Lycurgan discipline was instantly reduced to chaos, dust, and mass graves. The Helots, vastly outnumbering their masters and sensing the absolute devastation of the Spartan state, seized the moment to annihilate their oppressors. Thousands of slaves across Messenia and Laconia armed themselves with stolen weapons, farm implements, and rocks, marching in a massive, uncoordinated wave toward the ruined city. King Archidamus, anticipating the slaughter, sounded the military trumpet amidst the rubble, rallying the surviving Spartan warriors. He formed a defensive perimeter of bleeding, dust-covered hoplites just in time to repel the initial, furious assault of the revolting slaves. Realizing they could not breach the disciplined Spartan line even in its ruined state, the Helots retreated to their ancestral stronghold on the towering heights of Mount Ithome. What followed was a grueling, massive, decade-long siege that paralyzed the Spartan state. The Spartans, masters of open-field infantry combat, lacked the engineering skills and siege equipment necessary to crack the fortified mountain. Desperate and bleeding manpower, the Ephors made the unprecedented decision to beg their rising rival, Athens, for military assistance. Athens dispatched a large force of heavily armed hoplites under the command of Cimon to aid in the siege. However, when the Athenians arrived at Mount Ithome, the Spartan magistrates, consumed by paranoia, suddenly feared that the democratic Athenians might sympathize with the enslaved Helots and switch sides. In a staggering display of political arrogance and fear, the Ephors abruptly dismissed the Athenian army, sending them away while retaining their other allies. This profound, public insult shattered the fragile alliance between the two powers, setting the stage for decades of catastrophic war. King Archidamus sounds the trumpet, rallying the survivors to arms. The aftermath of the massive Helot revolt permanently tightened the grip of the Spartan secret police and intensified the brutal paranoia of the Ephors. The government viewed any deviation from strict Lycurgan law as an existential threat to the survival of the state. This ruthless internal purging claimed even their greatest war heroes. Pausanias, the regent who had commanded the vast allied army to victory at Plataea, had been sent to Byzantium to command the Greek fleet. There, he adopted Persian clothing, surrounded himself with bodyguards, and began brutalizing allied commanders, operating entirely outside the rigid control of the Spartan state. The Ephors, fearing Pausanias was conspiring with the Persian king to stage a coup and liberate the Helots, issued the Skytale, a cryptographically sealed message on a leather strip, demanding his immediate return to Sparta. Upon his arrival, the secret police arrested him. Pausanias managed to break free and sprinted into the sacred sanctuary of the temple of Athena Chakioikos, claiming divine asylum. The Spartan magistrates were barred by absolute religious law from spilling blood inside the temple, but they circumvented the wrath of the gods through cold, calculated cruelty. They ordered the doors of the temple to be heavily barricaded with stone and brick, trapping the hero of Plataea inside, without food or water. They ripped the roof off the sanctuary, exposing him to the brutal elements. The state allowed Pausanias to slowly starve to death, surrounded by the gold and bronze offerings of the goddess. Just as his breathing became shallow and death was imminent, the magistrates dragged his emaciated body across the threshold so his corpse would not pollute the sacred ground. The stench of rotting grain and burning olive groves permeated the surrounding valleys as the state simultaneously unleashed vicious reprisal campaigns against the remaining Helid insurgents. The execution of Pausanias sent a chilling message throughout the Peloponnese. The Spartan state was absolute, and no individual, regardless of royal blood or military glory, was immune to its terror. The diplomatic fallout from the dismissal of the Athenian forces at Mount Ithome boiled over into the First Peloponnesian War, a series of proxy conflicts and brutal border skirmishes that entrenched the bitter divide between the Spartan land power and the Athenian naval empire. An Athenian delegation sails away from the Peloponnese in disgrace. The simmering tensions between the militaristic land power of Sparta and the wealthy naval empire of Athens finally erupted into the devastating, 3-decade-long Peloponnesian War. The Spartan strategy, dictated by King Archidamus, was straightforward and brutally physical. March the massive army of the Peloponnesian League directly into the region of Attica, destroy the agricultural base, and force the Athenian hoplites into a decisive, open-field battle. Every summer, the Spartan vanguard crossed the border, systematically hacking down ancient olive trees, torching wheat fields, and destroying the physical infrastructure that supported the Athenian populace. However, the Athenian statesman Pericles refused to engage the superior Spartan infantry. He ordered the entire population of Attica to abandon their farms and retreat behind the impregnable stone defenses of the Long Walls, a massive fortification complex connecting the city of Athens to its heavily defended port of Piraeus. The Spartans, utterly lacking in siege engines or the logistical capability to sustain a year-round blockade, could only stand in the ruined fields and watch. The smoke of burning Athenian villages choked the horizon, visible from the Acropolis, yet the Athenian gates remained firmly barred. This strategy of attrition backfired terribly on both sides. The severe overcrowding within the unhygienic, walled confines of Athens sparked a catastrophic plague that decimated the population, killing Pericles and thousands of citizens. The Spartans, terrified of catching the disease, frequently cut their devastating raids short and retreated back to the Peloponnese. The war settled into a grueling, bloody stalemate. Sparta could ravage the land, but Athens used its dominant fleet to import grain from the Black Sea and launch punishing amphibious raids along the vulnerable coastline of the Peloponnese, directly inciting the Helots to rebel. The Spartan state, entirely reliant on the labor of slaves, was forced to deploy its heavily armed warriors in a constant, exhausting game of territorial defense. The economy of terror began to fracture as the state stretched its limited manpower across multiple fronts. Archidamus pushed his men to their absolute physical limits, enforcing marches through brutal summer heat and torrential rains, attempting to crack the walls of a city that was fed entirely by the sea. The Spartan infantry withdraws before the autumn rains. The myth of Spartan invincibility was permanently shattered on the rocky, unforgiving shores of western Greece. The Athenian general Demosthenes, commanding a fleet on a completely different mission, recognized the strategic value of the rugged promontory of Pylos. He landed his forces, rapidly built stone fortifications, and established a permanent garrison deep in the heart of Messenian territory, a beacon actively encouraging the massive Helot population to defect. The Spartan ephors panicked. They immediately recalled their army from Attica and marched their forces directly to the coast, desperate to crush the beachhead before a full-scale slave revolt erupted. The Spartans launched a furious, coordinated assault by land and sea. They landed a contingent of 420 elite Spartiates, commanded by Epitatus, onto the narrow, densely wooded island of Sphacteria, to block the harbor entrance. The assault on the Athenian fort was a brutal failure. Spartan ships rammed the rocky shore, and heavily armored warriors tried to fight their way up the steep, jagged cliffs, only to be pushed back into the sea by relentless Athenian defense. The biting sting of sea spray and arrows raining from the cliffs decimated the Spartan boarding parties. The Athenian fleet counterattacked, securing the harbor and completely cutting off the Spartan hoplites trapped on the island. For over 2 months, the elite Spartan warriors were stranded, forced to survive on meager rations smuggled in by helot divers under the cover of darkness. The Athenians finally launched a massive amphibious assault, burning the dense forest that covered the island to expose the Spartan positions. Thousands of light-armed Athenian troops swarmed the ash-covered rocks, refusing to engage in hand-to-hand combat, instead burying the heavy infantry under a relentless hail of arrows, javelins, and stones. The Spartans, choked by smoke and physically exhausted from the constant barrage, were slowly pushed back to an ancient fort at the edge of the island. Epitatus was killed, and the surviving Spartan commander made an unprecedented, world-shocking decision. Instead of fighting to the death in the tradition of Thermopylae, the remaining 120 full Spartan citizens lowered their shields and surrendered to the Athenians. The capitulation sent shockwaves across the entire Mediterranean. The invincible Spartan war machine had broken. The captives were dragged to Athens, paraded as hostages to prevent any further invasions of Attica. The captive warriors are loaded into the hulls of Athenian triremes. With their elite warriors held hostage in Athens and their homeland vulnerable to continuous raids, the Spartan state was forced into a desperate strategic pivot. The brilliant, unorthodox Spartan general Brasidas realized that defeating Athens required severing their vital supply lines. He gathered a small force composed primarily of heavily armed helots, promised their freedom in exchange for their brutal labor, and marched entirely out of the Peloponnese, launching a rapid, devastating campaign far to the north in the region of Thrace. Brasidas bypassed heavily defended strongholds and struck directly at Amphipolis, the crucial Athenian colony that supplied the timber necessary to build their massive fleets and the silver to pay their rowers. He did not rely solely on brute force. He used aggressive diplomacy and swift military intimidation to flip Athenian allies to the Spartan side. He marched his men relentlessly through the freezing mud of the Thracian winter, arriving outside city gates before the Athenians even realized his army was in the region. The sudden loss of Amphipolis threw the Athenian assembly into a violent panic, leading to the deployment of a massive counterforce commanded by the aggressive politician Cleon. The two armies finally clashed in the brutal, chaotic Battle of Amphipolis. Brasidas executed a rapid, aggressive sally out of the city gates, catching the Athenian army completely out of formation as they attempted to withdraw. The Spartan heavy infantry slammed into the retreating columns, shattering their lines and causing a mass rout. Both commanders paid the ultimate price for the engagement. Cleon was cut down while fleeing, and Brasidas was mortally wounded during the furious charge, living just long enough to hear that his forces had achieved a crushing victory. The deaths of the two most aggressive leaders on both sides temporarily exhausted the warring states. The Spartan hostages in Athens, the heavy casualties, and the massive financial drain forced both powers to the negotiating table. The resulting peace of Nicias was a fragile, bitter armistice that returned the captured territories and brought the captive Spartan warriors back to the Eurotas Valley. But the fundamental dispute remained unresolved. The brutal gears of the war machine were only paused, not broken. The funeral procession of Brasidas winds through the city gates. The final, catastrophic phase of the Peloponnesian War forced Sparta to permanently abandon its isolationist principles and align with the ancient enemy. The Spartan commander Lysander, a ruthless and fiercely ambitious naval tactician, recognized that destroying the Athenian Empire required completely dominating the sea. To achieve this, he traveled to Asia Minor and secured massive funding from Cyrus, a prince of the Persian Empire. The Spartan state, which had once banned all gold and silver, now used vast quantities of Persian coin to construct massive fleets of triremes and hire thousands of mercenary rowers. The war shifted from the destruction of crops to the strangulation of trade. Sparta established a permanent, fortified garrison at Decelia, just outside Athens, preventing the Athenians from ever farming their land and encouraging over 20,000 Athenian slaves to defect. The final blow came at the Hellespont. Lysander anchored his massive Persian-funded fleet at Agoge, directly across the narrow strait from the Athenian armada. For days, the Athenians sailed out to offer battle, and for days, Lysander refused to engage, keeping his men strictly on the beaches. On the fifth day, when the Athenian crews disembarked to forage for food, Lysander ordered a sudden, devastating strike. The Spartan galleys rowed furiously across the strait, smashing into the beached and defenseless Athenian ships. The sharp crack of timber shattering on the rocky shoreline signaled the absolute annihilation of Athenian naval supremacy. Without their fleet, Athens could no longer import grain. Lysander blockaded the port of Piraeus, systematically starving the entire population of the city into absolute submission over a grueling, brutal winter. When the city finally surrendered, the Spartans dismantled the Athenian empire. They forced the starving citizens to physically tear down the massive stone blocks of their own long walls to the mocking sound of Spartan flute players. Lysander installed a brutal, pro-Spartan oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants to purge the democratic leadership of the defeated city. He did not show mercy. The victory was secured through absolute terror and the mass execution of political enemies. Lysander orders the execution of 3,000 Athenian prisoners. The total victory over Athens inflated the Spartan Empire to an unsustainable scale, driving the state toward imperial overreach and inevitable collapse. Spartan governors and heavily armed garrisons occupied cities across the Aegean, demanding brutal tribute and violently suppressing any political dissent. King Agesilaus even launched a massive military campaign directly into Persian territory in Asia Minor, a staggering projection of power that required bleeding the already depleted Spartan citizenry. This aggressive dominance alienated their former allies, sparking the Corinthian War and forcing the Spartans to constantly battle uprisings across multiple fronts. The fatal blow to Spartan supremacy did not come from Athens or Persia, but from the rising power of Thebes. Under the brilliant tactical command of Epaminondas, the Theban military completely revolutionized hoplite warfare. When the Spartan army, commanded by King Cleombrotus, marched into Boeotia to crush the Thebans, they met them on the plains of Leuctra. The Spartans deployed in their traditional, rigid formation, placing their elite warriors on the right wing, fully expecting to easily outflank and crush the enemy line through the sheer brute force of the Othismos. Epaminondas, however, heavily stacked his left wing, massing his heavy infantry an unprecedented 50 shields deep. At the very front of this massive block stood the Sacred Band, a fiercely elite unit of 300 paired lovers. As the battle commenced, the Theban left advanced rapidly while the rest of their line held back. The earth-shaking thud of the 50-deep Theban phalanx crashing into the Spartan line instantly halted the Spartan advance. The sheer weight and momentum of the Theban column physically crushed the Spartan right wing, shattering the invincible bronze wall. King Cleombrotus was struck down in the brutal melee, and for the first time in centuries, the elite Spartan heavy infantry broke and fled from an open battlefield. Nearly 400 full Spartan citizens, a massive percentage of their already dwindling population, were slaughtered in the dirt at Leuctra. The myth of Spartan invincibility was permanently destroyed, and the tactical superiority of their phalanx was rendered obsolete by the sheer brutal mass of the Theban formation. The remaining Spartan survivors retreat silently under the cover of darkness. The tactical disaster at Leuctra triggered the absolute and rapid collapse of the Spartan state. Epaminondas did not stop at defeating the Spartan army in the field. He launched a massive, unprecedented invasion directly into the heart of the Peloponnese. For the first time in hundreds of years, hostile forces marched down the Eurotas Valley. The unwalled city of Sparta was utterly defenseless. The remaining Spartan forces barricaded the streets with rubble, watching helplessly as the Theban army systematically burned the surrounding agricultural estates and completely ravaged the land that fed the military machine. The most devastating blow was political and geographic. Epaminondas marched his forces over the Taygetos Mountains into Messenia and officially liberated the Helot population. He ordered the construction of a massive, heavily fortified city at Mount Ithome, named Mycenae, and a defensive coalition city to the north, Megalopolis. The physical chains were torn from the slaves, and the massive, fertile agricultural base that had sustained the Spartan army for centuries was permanently severed. Without the enslaved labor of the Helots, the Spartan citizens could no longer maintain their strict military training. They were forced to farm their own dwindling plots of land to survive. The state suffered a catastrophic demographic collapse known as oliganthropia. The constant warfare, the strict inheritance laws, and the mass casualties at Leuctra had reduced the number of full Spartiate citizens from 10,000 to mere hundreds. The relentless, punishing machinery of the Lycurgan system broke down, unable to function without the terrorized slave class beneath it. Sparta was permanently reduced to a second-rate power, completely marginalized by the massive empires of Macedon and, eventually, Rome. In its final, pathetic state under the Roman Empire, Sparta became a grotesque tourist attraction. Wealthy Romans traveled to the Eurotas Valley to watch young Spartan boys be brutally whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia, treating the ancient, terrifying rituals of the Agoge as a bloody theatrical spectacle. The great military hegemon that had defeated the Persian Empire and crushed Athens was reduced to performing its own ancient trauma for the amusement of foreign masters. The cold wind whistling through the abandoned barracks carries the dust over the ruined altars. A single Roman spectator tosses a coin into the dust,